All right. So for most people who cover music and whatnot, the year is done. They've made their lists. They've heard everything they need to hear. The year is over for them. Here, I still have a full month of coverage to go here in December. It's all going to be pretty compact into about 2 weeks. But before we get there, we have to finish off November with a list of 20 of the best albums. And this comes sort of on the brunt, on the edge. We're getting right towards the cliff of switching over to mystification.com instead of grizzlybutts.com. And that will not mean a whole lot of difference for this type of list, other than it will be on a print zine or a PDF zine to start. You can print it out if you want. And then the full list will be available shortly after the PDF comes out, and that will be a full thing that I've detailed before in other places. For now, we're finishing off 2023 with a lot of things. There are still album of the year contenders coming out in the next 3 weeks, so I would encourage people not to pick your list until you've heard at least there's like a Phobocosm record. There's a bunch of other stuff that's really great coming up that you probably want to hear. I think Inculture still has a record that's coming out. A lot of great stuff. So keep your ears out for that. Hopefully I'll cover most of it before the 15th to the 21st, and that's where I'll be writing a lot of my usual yearly lists. If you're familiar with the site, I'm going to be writing less lists this year, as was the case last year. I don't think that going through and picking through the bins has yielded much enjoyment, I guess, over the last few years, because there's been such a glut of substandard product. And that's the nice way of putting it, I guess, is that I'll be cutting down to the releases that were important that I didn't cover, and stuff that meets a really high standard that I would at least consider for the end of the year. So with all of that said, this number one album of the month meets the very highest standard as far as I'm concerned for death metal. It's Cruciamentum's Obsidian Refractions, which came out late in the month. This is the second full-length album from the band, and it follows a very well-celebrated debut from, I bet, what was it, 2015, 2016, back in the day. And they've returned with pretty much an all-new lineup. A lot of really great musicians have joined the band, and they've put out a pretty pristine, doomed and atmospheric death metal record that is traditional, full of riffs, and a lot of fire to it. There's, if you're a fan of Dead Congregation and sort of that style of death metal, I think this is a very important contribution to that realm, and just a great band overall, and I'm glad to see them back. This was my most listened to album of the month, and probably one that I'll carry over most likely to somewhere in the top end of my best of the year list. It's that good, and it might seem understated, 6 songs, just a death metal album proper and all that, but I think once you've really sat with this record, you'll understand why it is special, and it does stand out in 2023 as a good, like an exceptional record. So give it some time if you're not feeling it right away. I kind of did. I knew kind of what to expect, and this kind of breached those expectations and beyond, and just a huge fan of the band. The third part in the Biolume trilogy from Midnight Odyssey is certainly one of their best records to date, and it completes a trilogy that is among their best work. And I think because during the process of this trilogy and some Dungeon Synth records and whatnot over the last 4 or 5 years, I feel like the Midnight Odyssey experience has come together into a thing which is bigger than it was before, and it's conglomerated a lot of other projects that had existed in other spaces that now create this sound for this band. And in a lot of ways, we get a lot of the epic doom metal and epic heavy metal feeling pieces here, but mostly this record represents a shift back to their more atmospheric style while retaining the atmosphere of the previous record. So if there is an odd album out in terms of the development of this trilogy, it's probably still the first one, as this follows up part 2 beautifully. They actually put back to back the 2 4-hour sort of sections here make for a grand listen, and it's just something that I was excited about before it came out, and I spent a lot of time listening to it. So that's a big recommendation for me. No question that people who followed me the longest understand that, especially for my Thrash Till Death series that I did a couple years ago, uh, death thrash metal, early death metal, 80s death metal, death, all that really lines up with my taste most often. And Sadus are an important band for technical thrash metal, progressive death metal in general, Bay Area thrash. They fit into a lot of places while being a unique entity, and one that was exciting back then and is still exciting now as they return after a very long time. I think their last full length was back in 2006, and here they return without Steve DiGiorgio, notably not on the bass here. And I think for a lot of people, that was an instant write-off. Like he just wasn't there, so they weren't going to listen. For me, I like every part of the Sadist discography, and The Shadow Inside reminds me more of the first two records in a more serious way. There was some of this on the second record as well, but I feel like the third record, I mean, this is kind of what Sadists have always been. This is the personality of the band. They just don't really have the progressive metal influenced bass sound on this record. So that's going to be a big ding for a lot of progressive death metal fans, but I think the thrash metal side and people who enjoy death thrash from the late 80s will really enjoy this record. It is not only catchy in its first half, but more cerebral in its themes throughout, and it's not just a throwaway comeback record. This is actually a pretty good record from Sadus, and one that I ended up listening to a lot more than I thought I would, so check that one out. Now, many people might think, well, Mortuary Drape is back from the grave, but I'm not sure that they ever left the graveyard. I don't think this is a band that people have been pining for a return for a very long time, but they have been put much more distance between records over the years, and they've had some never really misfires, but there were some more modern records in the 2000s that I think a lot of people veered away from compared to some of their other material. And this record and their previous record, for me, are some of their best material. It's some of their most representative material, and it has a lot of the affect and feeling of their earliest material, which is sort of king for a lot of people. It's a very influential black metal band, and one that represents heavy metal and thrash metal along the way. So this is a very important band for me, and one that helped me get into black metal in general, along with Verathron and groups like that. So a higher recommendation for me, just because I'd like more people to understand just how cool this band is, but also this is actually one of their better records. It's very memorable, and now they've gone as far as to kind of try to pull off the King Diamond thing. There's like a little bit more. There's a little bit more Merciful Fate on this record, and I got a kick out of it. I think it's a pretty good record. I really enjoy the way that the public will often perceive an underground black metal record as avant-garde or strange or an oddity, when really it's not that uncommon for the general headspace of a certain scene, or just in generally what you get from more popular bands. That's not to say that Toten, this Polish black metal trio, sound like Behemoth. They certainly don't, but there is something that is very readable and easy to approach here, as they use very catchy grooves and riffs and things to connect with the listener in an immediate way, and it makes for a less dissonant side of the band, as is the case with a lot of bands going through the pandemic. The lineup of this band changed, and so the style of the band actually changed dramatically too, where it's a little bit less death metal and dissonance in its phrasing, but that still exists. So this is a little bit more accessible, but that made it all the more interesting, because this is something I haven't seen a lot of people really praising for how interesting and good this record is as a full listen, one that develops even more so in the middle and the second half, and presents a lot of catchier songs up front. So a solid recommendation for me, and a record I think more people should give a chance. Yeah, I think that November is one of those months where I think there's so many great records that even this latest record from Convocation gets pushed down to like number 6 on a list, where rightfully it should be up closer to number 1 wherever it is. This is a very accomplished and memorable funeral doom metal band from Finland, who not only keep the tradition of Finnish funeral doom metal alive in the way that they construct these pieces and as they become more elaborate, but also death metal continues to be an important part of what they do, and that means big and aggressive rhythms that have riffs, and funeral death doom metal that has riffs is one of my favorite things, and they pull off this enormous atmosphere and very expressive vocalizations in a way that begins to give Convocation their own personality. I think that there was this real big interest in previous projects, as well as who they sounded like when they first started, that spurned my interest. And now that they're started to do their own thing even more, I see the art of it a little bit more, and I've started to understand the personality of the band a little bit better through their recordings. So I've really enjoyed this one, and I think for a lot of people who are even remotely interested in funeral doom and death doom, this is going to be an essential record for this month. Blood and Journ is the second full-length album from elcare, and this is an atmospheric black metal band from Denmark, sort of the northern part of Denmark, and their themes are, I thought initially they were just maritime historical warfare, but they've moved to land here, the lowlands in Denmark and North Germany, and they've highlighted a very tragic event here, and one that defined the borders between Denmark and Germany. So otherwise, this is a very set-aback atmospheric black metal record with very accomplished melodic guitar work that still has a very deep underground feeling to it. There's a lot of character to the production values and the way they presented this record, which are it's going to be like a bit obscure sounding for a lot of people who aren't in tune with what the underground atmospheric and obscure black metal sound is going for. But for me, this is kind of that perfect development of the sort of what I consider the endless run sort of black metal records, where they've found a melodic device and they're able to just wield it endlessly into these long and involved pieces, and they've gotten this down to the point where they're telling these elaborate stories that I quite enjoy for their historic value, but also just learning a bit while enjoying music. So this was especially my kind of thing, and I've rated their other records about as highly in the past. So I definitely recommend getting into this band. It's probably easier to start with their first record. Stench of the Unholy Graves is the second full-length album from Infamous, a Chilean death metal band, and one that would match probably your interest if you were interested in the Cruciamentum album and you really liked that mixture of incantation-esque and Morbid Angel influenced death metal. You'll understand why this is a great record up here on my list this month as well, because it is in that traditional, but still carried through the early 2000s, kind of late 90s to 2000s, early 2000s death metal with plenty of riffs, plenty of aggression, and a lot of personality. Now, if you're a fan of Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, and you kind of get sick of people comparing things to that record, well, this does take influence from that, but it's actually in the leads a little bit this time. And there's a couple of early songs that you'll find that pretty obvious. But there are other aspects to this music that go darker than just a Morbid Angel influence, and I think that this is an impressive record, which follows up the more frantic and cryptic side of their debut, and gives it a little bit more of an aggression. And I think they did well to keep it at about like 35 minutes, so that they burn through it, and it's a pretty aggressive and exciting listen, and just a solid overall death metal album in the best tradition. So this hasn't necessarily been a drought year for avant-garde and dissonant black metal, but I would say there haven't been as many standout events as one would expect. And for my taste, and here in late November, this is definitely a standout event here in the second full-length album from Alcan, Mêlée des Aurores, a Quebec-based black metal group who have changed from kind of an atmospheric / melodic sound that was a bit eerie and ghastly back in the early 2010s, and now for the second record they've returned and part of this record is dissonance and atmosphere, and creating sort of an alchemical sound experiment where they improvise, but not in an obvious way, throughout these long and extended pieces. There's elements that reminded me of Portal just as much as something like an Icelandic black metal band otherwise. So there's a lot to really glean from these pieces. There's a lot of emergent events that you might not realize are improvised up front, and I think maybe even if you're a fan of like something like Kralis, you'll understand why there's a lot of cool moments on this record. And I particularly like the vocalist as well. I like his tone, and I think this music fits that sort of meanness that he gets out of there. So go ahead and check that out if that's your kind of thing. Thestructor is kind of a staple in underground Ohio heavy metal, and a band that, they definitely had a tragic beginning. They had a very high point with their first record in 1985, and tragedy struck, and they didn't really pick things back up until 1999. When they picked it back up, it took them a while to sort of get their bearings, but they certainly did, and they put out a lot of great records since. They have 20 years worth of great heavy metal records behind them, and this is one of them. This is probably one of their best records for my taste. It is a very traditional heavy metal record. It certainly looks all the way back to the early 80s for elements of Manowar and Iron Maiden in that sense, and it's very approachable for that fact. But they also have always had interest in power metal and speed metal, and that translates to double bass drumming, riffs, and more than just melodies carrying these songs. They're actually pretty thrilling listen, and if you're a fan of United States power metal of the 80s, and maybe less so the Priest influenced variation, this is going to be your band. Legions of men, notice the iron slave, story spoken, metal valor, together forever. Typhotantric Aphorisms from the Arachneophidian Koran is the latest full-length album from Tetragrammaticide. It's their second album, and this Kolkata, India, I think they're mostly based out of India and maybe Russia. This band, they're an occult black metal band and a death metal band also. They've sort of been tagged as a war metal band and a noise, like a warfare noise kind of band early on, but their sound has developed quickly, and now this is much more of a black and death metal record, and a great one too. It's got that, they focus on the riffs quite a lot. There's sort of a machined energy to all of it that's aggressive and crazed, that keeps everything sounding violent, murderous and unhinged throughout this full listen. And I think it's easily been one of the most exciting sophomore releases, second album from a band this year, in terms of how much they've changed and how much they've refined their sound, both atmospherically and building sort of a concept from that and their outrageous lyrics and song titles, but also backing that up with substance in terms of really well curated art and just riffs and making great death metal. I think that's part of it, is that this is just it's enjoyable on many levels, and one of the important ones is that they've got riffs. So I had a great time with this record, and I think that if it doesn't, if you're worried that it's going to be like a war metal album with noise experiments, that was kind of the band in the past, and there's other bands that are doing that now. This is something that's a little bit more just metal up front, and I enjoyed it. Songdoon Nuit Soleil is the latest full-length album from Elcare, a Quebec-based black metal band, and I would consider them a melodic and atmospheric black metal band, primarily dealing with very strong melodic threads as their sort of main device for creating these songs. This release, I think I should have spent more time with it and done a full review on it, but I placed it in my Nothing But November Black Metal November column when I should have spent more time with it, because it is probably one of their best records to date. If you're a fan of their previous records, these are like plague themed and kind of grotesque records that deal with sickness and evil and whatnot and cults, and they bring beautiful music into it. I think on par with a lot of the best stuff coming out of France, the sort of lead driven medieval black metal style. This is kind of an alternative to that is slightly more melodic in a rhythmic sense, and a very fine band in general. Definitely don't overlook this one if you're looking for black metal this month. So Crystal Awe is the latest full-length album from Mepharash, and I would primarily call this band a black metal group in spirit, but they've changed quite a bit over the years, and their agnostic themes and all that have advanced to the point where now they're making hymnal black metal music that is completely non-traditional in many senses, but also has sort of some theatrical rock influences to it. It's not in a cheesy sort of way that we get from a lot of Scandinavian metal, but more very serious and in character most of the time. And they've shown that they're very smart composers, in the sense that there's some classical backing to the way that they've constructed, particularly the vocal devices of this record and the melodic parts of it, but it's still there's still a bit of a kind of progressive rock girding the sort of machine, as it were. So it's a hard album to describe. It's sort of like if Batushka was a little bit more interesting, or Swedish and used to play black and death metal. So anyway, it's a great record. You should just check it out and see what it sounds like, to sort of get past the difficulty of describing what it is. Philosopher is the latest full-length album from Eternus, and it's their 9th full-length album, and you'd wonder, do they have anything left to say after that last record? The previous record was such an event in terms of bringing the Eternus sound into the modern day, bringing this very mature and sophisticated render and this very measured and fairly minimal production value. Is this perfect record from this band, who are looking back on their discography and finding their own personality and bringing it into a current and here and now state. And I don't mean that in like a pretentious progressivist sort of way. I just mean that it felt elevated and like a real extension of their work. And Philosopher just takes it one step further, basically by infusing a little bit more of the extreme metal elements. The drumming kicks up just a little bit more often into their sort of signature frenetics, and a lot of the guitar melodies develop in a very classic way you'd expect from Eternus. They're still a dark metal band, which is kind of a mixture of melodic black metal and death metal, and their own narrative style, as well as the guitarist and vocalist's leads, which are his own work. But this is just a little bit of a darker turn beyond the last record. They've dirtied it up a little bit. And most of this record deals with elaborate lyrical concepts and conversational aspects, which make it less tuneful, a little bit less memorable than their last couple of records. But that doesn't really hurt it for my taste. It just changes the recommendation because it'll be a little bit heady, a little bit much to take in, and it will feel like a bit of a flat line in terms of a long conversation. And maybe not everyone's up for long conversation, but I sure was, and I'm still a huge fan of this band. Embalmed in Decay is the latest full-length album from Caral Tomb, a German death metal band, and I would say a fairly classic-sounding one. Their interest is not necessarily the typical Swedish death metal sound, but maybe the point where it crossed over with both British and United States death metal all at once, and in that sense, they keep these songs interesting with their rhythmic developments. This is a riff-focused band, and they're getting better with each record. I think it's as simple as that. Like, I stuck with this record and listened to it like 30 times because the riffs were good, and that was it, you know. And they're getting a little bit, like I said, they're getting better with each record at what they do. This is probably their most tuneful record. I think their last one was maybe a little bit more just aggressive and to the point, and now they're getting to just writing a little bit more memorable songs. Inward to Gethsemane is the latest full-length album from Vastum, a death metal band from the Oakland, California area, and an important one for not only the stable of this, their $20 spin, this label, but a band that a lot of people view as kind of a pillar of weird and interesting death metal in that scene, as well as just kind of the United States for a certain time period. And they've carried on pretty well here with the fifth full-length album by continuing to add to the signature of the band with a lot of unique vocal experiments and atmospheric building and a lot of that. But they've kept the point that it is about the riffs, and this is classic death metal in a lot of sense, while keeping it weird in their own way with the lyrics, which are even more disturbing every time you read them, and however you decide to interpret them. It's a pretty exciting band in that regard, and I've been a fan for a long time, and I was pretty pleased with this one. I would say it's one of their better records, so definitely don't skip out on that one. Now, a lot of the biggest records came out here in November because it's kind of a time to be ambitious and put out this end of the year contender, the best of, the biggest record. And in a lot of ways, Throne of the Lunar Soul is certainly the case made for one of the bigger and more ambitious black metal records of the year, even though it's a slippery slope. There's a lot of bands out there that are doing a lot with black metal, and this is maybe more focused on the symphonic Black Death and United States black metal zeitgeist as it was back in the late 90s till now. And that might feel like an oversimplification, but the elements of Black Death and thrash metal are still there in Valdrin's sound, and they kind of go a little bit heavy metal in the middle of this record. It's pretty interesting. I kind of like the way they do that. They keep things thrashing. A lot of it gets very catchy, and then they kind of go a little bit too far with it in the second half. It stops being about the riff and the aggression and more about developing these both choral and symphonic ideas. And those melodic ideas don't always really pay off with a song for my taste in the second half, but it's such a big album. There's so much to like. I still rated it very highly, and I'm still enjoying it now. I think this is a really strong contrast to the rest of their discography, which has been kind of packed front to back with ideas. And in this case, the extra time has allowed the double album has allowed them to breathe in enough space to tell a story here on the second record, or this latest record. So definitely don't skip that one. Adria is his second full-length album from Zon. This is a German band who fuse elements of krautrock, post-punk, noise rock, and sludge and post-metal a little bit even, all the way through kind of non-heavy music subgenres to create this instrumental record. It's a double LP, and it's quite an involved one. It's one that has several very long pieces. It feels like sort of a Beats album in a lot of ways, but it's, despite not having vocals, I remained entertained with this record more than usual. I think this type of thing is more of a passing fancy for me, where I'll pick it up, I'll listen once and move on, but I kept coming back to this record because I found it was that captivating, and I've enjoyed their past work. I liked their first record. I like the records that they've done with Heads. And so this was just something I fell into and I couldn't get out. Skigen Off Livet is the latest full-length, or the first full-length album from Sort Sind, a Danish black death metal band, and one that fuses elements of melodic black metal in the traditional sense, and with just a lot of aggressive death metal compositional tendencies. That means this record is packed with riffs, and that's why it appeals to me. It's short, to the point, cuts right through 100 riffs, and the folks involved have impressed with their fusion of black and death metal in this case. I'd like to see them stretch the melodic side a little bit more, but if you're a fan of, this sort of death metal turn that Sacramentum took on their third album, or just early Dawn, there's elements of pieces in there that will keep you entertained if you like that kind of thing, whereas they just they attack the riffs throughout if you like that kind of thing. So I was a fan of it and rated it highly. Now, I had a lot to choose from for the final pick. The 20th is always a difficult choice on a month like this, but I went with Aliens, Echoes of the Future, because it's just that memorable. I'm such a fan of classic melodic death metal, even going into the early 2000s, and this is a band that felt like a very purely late 90s, but still conscious of the early 90s kind of melodic death metal band. They've got a little bit of dissection in there too. They've always been accused of sounding a little bit like Insomnium, and all that is well enough, but I feel like they pulled into their own here. They've written these catchy songs that deserve to be remembered on their own. I don't think every moment on this record is all that original, but it doesn't hurt the fact that it's so memorable and a great listen. So, it's I think they get better with each record, and this is their sort of high point at this point. So there are a lot of honorable mentions this month, and I think I'll just go through a few here to make sure that you don't miss out on some of these. I think if you're a fan of war metal, and whenever it crosses over distinctly with death metal, such as Bolt Thrower, Left Crosses, Upon Desecrated Altars is an important and easy thing to pick up. I think if you like death, doom, and the classic stuff from the early 90s, Carcinoids and Coming into Extinction gives a little bit of a modern production sound to that approach, and it's solid. If you're a fan of power thrash metal in the classic sense, and you like a little bit of progressive thrash metal otherwise, in the Vector style, Venus is Obscured Until Observed is a great choice. And if you're a fan of atmospheric black metal, and you like Ungfell and those sort of folkish, uh, that sort of stuff out of Switzerland, Kvelgeist's second full-length album is one of the better records out this year. I sort of reviewed it later on in the month. Otherwise, there's a lot to pick from here, a lot to find out there. Otherwise, yourself, those are just the things that I liked.